College Football Nerds here talking Notre Dame and USC. Huge game this season, 2023. It's a huge game every season. College Football Nerds here talking with my main nerd, Josh. I want to remind y'all, like and subscribe if you haven't already. Helps us out a ton. We're going to show you a model that we've got available to you on collegefootballnerds.com where you can check it out for yourself. It's free. You can play around and do your own game simulations, the same ones we've been doing on this show for years. We've released that model to you, as well as a top 25 that you can contribute to, a pick'em contest that you can also play along with, and all kinds of other advanced stats, relative performance stats, rankings for teams and players. Go check it out, collegefootballnerds.com. All right, Josh, this game is maybe gotten a little bit less shine on it because of what happened last weekend. Both USC struggling with Arizona and Notre Dame taking the loss to Louisville. And we have talked for years about Notre Dame's schedule. People always like to bag on Notre Dame because there are seasons, many times, multiple seasons in a row, where a lot of the name brands they schedule and a lot of the ACC teams that they've scheduled just aren't very good. And it turns out that Notre Dame has a 1 or 2 game season. Still hard because you're playing teams that are down relative to their standard, but it's a lot of Power 5 teams that do recruit some sort of level of talent. Well, this year it was flipped. This year, not only did they have the Ohio State game to kind of bolster their schedule, and then USC in the middle or towards the end, this year, a lot of those teams that they were counting on being a little bit of a breather game were slugfests, including Duke right after Ohio State, and then Louisville right after that. 3 good teams in a row. I think people are going to think negatively of Notre Dame because of the close game with Duke, the game with Ohio State, and now the loss to Louisville. But in my opinion, you tell me if I'm wrong, this game came at the worst possible time, both in the attraction of looking forward to USC and just being exhausted for playing a few good teams in a row.
I don't think there's any doubt that the Notre Dame schedule this year is more difficult. In a lot of prior years, we've noted that in Sagarin, they end up really high, and in something like FEI's elite schedule, they end up lower, meaning Sagarin specifically measures difficulty in making a bowl, the odds of going 6-6. There aren't many weak teams on Notre Dame's schedule in given years, so it's hard to win 6 games. SEC teams tend to have more like 3 baked-in easy wins every year. It's easy to go 6-6. But going 11-1 in the SEC West is brutally hard because that's more about your 4 hardest games. And Notre Dame's schedule usually doesn't have 4 really good top 15 teams on the same schedule. It is the opposite dynamic. They do have a lot of top teams this year on that schedule. A lot of teams that have been down are back up again. And what Notre Dame's run into is the same kind of grind that, SEC teams do complain about. And yeah, they dropped one they probably shouldn't have and wouldn't normally drop. That's just the reality of the situation. And it in some ways, I think it's completely fair. And in other ways, quite frankly, you have to take a step back and acknowledge for these Big Ten teams, the Big Ten East, SEC West, this is what they've been griping about. And so I completely understand why Notre Dame ended up in the boat they're in, but I also think you have to recognize that this has always been a legitimate gripe when you have a schedule like, again, Notre Dame has this year, and a lot of those other teams don't. And I think, there's one thing that was really interesting to me in both the loss to Louisville and in the close game to Arizona from USC, and that was consistency at the quarterback position. Now, I've always said I thought Sam Hartman is a really good quarterback, but I've also thought that when you really go dive into his statistics, I am not as high on him because there's so many games historically where he just doesn't really show up. That happened here against Louisville. 22 of 38, 6.7 yards per attempt. I know pass rush is an issue. I know other things are an issue, but it is a genuine problem with Sam Hartman. 2 touchdown, 3 interception game. He has done that his entire career. In games where people aren't looking, sometimes he just doesn't perform. And I will say Caleb Williams had an off game in a lot of respects. USC didn't put up great statistics. And I think of a lot of what you saw last week, it was good, 8.8 yards per attempt, but it was only 14 of 25 passing, 56% completion percentage, 1 touchdown, and he only rushed for about 40 yards. these teams are gonna live and die on their quarterbacks, and this past week was a week where neither one of them did well, and they didn't do well. One, because the quarterbacks weren't in rhythm, and two, they weren't in rhythm because both teams got punched in the mouth a little bit at the line of scrimmage. I think that's an intensity issue. I think it's a focus issue. It's going to be something they have to both deal on off and on because the Pac-12 is up. Notre Dame's composite schedule is up. They're going to have a lot of tough, grinding game schedule series for both of them. But I also don't necessarily think that is completely indicative of who they are, and I don't think that's something you necessarily should expect to repeat in this game.
Yeah, I think that one of the reasons I really felt like this was a look-ahead situation for USC was, look, we know that USC doesn't play good defense. Like it's out there, it's obvious. Like that's not a slight to USC. That's just stating the truth. But they're down 17-0, like nothing. Like it was just a snap of the fingers, 17-0, and then they didn't exactly like crush it the rest of the way. They scored points and they obviously got it in the 40s to win the game in triple overtime. But to me, that's a look-ahead situation when you can't score effectively against Arizona, a team that gave up 31 in a loss to Mississippi State. We know USC also, the given that we have on the defensive side of the ball, we have also on the offensive side of the ball. They can score generally 30 to 40 points on anybody, and they were just sleepwalking. And that offensive line was giving up sacks with a three-man rush off the edge multiple times in a row. Like that to me, like you said, is more of a focus thing for me. Turn it around, though, what's interesting here is Notre Dame is favored in this game by 2.5 points. Undefeated Southern Cal, ranked number 10, is a dog against two-loss Notre Dame, who just lost by double digits to Louisville.
Do you mind if I go ahead and bring up the model? Because I think it's relevant.
Bring it up.
Yeah, so through the magic of editing, at some point, Daniel is going to throw the model slide in here. But what you're going to see is our model is pretty consistent with that. It has it Notre Dame 45.8, USC 41.1. Silly high numbers, but not silly when you consider where USC's defense is and how good the offense is. And so it's not surprising. It's what's I think interesting, as is often the case by this point. We always say about week 6 to week 8 is when the model really comes into its own. It starts to look a lot like the Vegas numbers. And the reality is USC's offense is so good, it can put up 40 points in most games. And they've had 2 games in a row now where they went long stretches against Colorado and now long stretches against Arizona where things weren't working right. There's a lot of finesse in this Lincoln Riley offense. Frankly, I think there are some issues where, as I understand it, I think Lincoln Riley stresses basically clean practice for the offense. There's not a ton of contact. They don't try to leverage the defense to disrupt the offense, and they just want to get clean repetition of looks. And sometimes when they get punched in the mouth and things don't work on the right timing, they can get thrown off. And when they're clicking, and they're phenomenal. And you kind of saw that. It's either they're in rhythm or when they're not in rhythm, they're really uncomfortable. This is still an offense that's probably going to put up 40 points. And what we just saw out of the Louisville game is I think this Notre Dame defense that had been really good to this point maybe was a little bit also due to some certain levels of competition offensively in their opponents. I don't know that Ohio State is that good offensively, and I'm not sure the other opponents were either. USC is a lot better. And just in terms of profiles, too, the model has Notre Dame at a pretty psychotic 8.5 yards per play. That's 7 yards a carry, 10.4 yards per attempt. I don't think that's unrealistic, given how good Hartman can be. When he's not getting pressured and he has time and he can throw in rhythm, he will tear you apart. USC has not. They've been a good pressure team, but they haven't been a good pressure team consistently enough for me to think it's going to translate against a much better Notre Dame offensive line than anyone they faced by a wide margin. And then USC offensively is so good that they're still going to have 7 yards per play, 8.5 yard per attempt, 5 yard per carry. That is a really good outing. It's not necessarily an utterly dominant one. And so you end up with a game where I think it's really saying that Notre Dame may outgain USC by a wide margin, and then the yardage differential is actually worse than the scoring differential. And that is due to, if you look at relative performance ranks, USC is 9th in passing, 15th in rushing, offense, and then 85th in passing defense, 125th in rushing defense. This is really just genuinely a story, no spin. USC is such a one-sided football team that every game is going to turn into a shootout. And in this case, Notre Dame is actually a little bit more efficient than USC in high yardage games. So it does expect that Notre Dame's going to end up winning by a few points, just like Vegas is projecting.
So here's something that is, interesting to me, because Notre Dame's favored, which I think is interesting, and it tells you that rankings are a little bit silly. It tells you that rankings aren't necessarily about – it does show that they're not power ratings, basically, and that's what Vegas is they're just basically doing power ratings. If the game turns out over 40 points, I don't think Notre Dame wins it, because I think that USC's offense is built to have a situation where they can score touchdowns, not just field goals, in 4, 5, 6 drives in a row if they need it. I think Notre Dame's offense is not in that way. So I think even against a very bad defense, like we see with LSU and USC, like USC got a very important interception to get their offense rolling last night. I think we see that even very bad defenses can stop you from scoring on 1 or 2 possessions where you really need to score to keep pace, and that's a problem. So in my opinion, I think the model number is, while it's in line with Vegas in terms of the score, I feel like there's a reason why it's way off in terms of over-under, because if this game is over 40 points, I don't see Notre Dame winning. If this game is where the over-under – go ahead.
You're going to say the over-under is what, 63 the last I saw?
62.5, 63, which says that they think that USC's offense is not going to be on fire like that against a good defense. That's interesting to me, where, Josh, tell me what you think. If the number is over 40, give me your out of 10 chances, 8 out of 10, 5 out of 10 chances that USC wins the game.
Honestly, it's probably 6 out of 10. I agree with you.
Okay.
I think in a very high-scoring game, USC is built to do that, and that's the rhythm thing. If it gets that high scoring, then USC's probably in rhythm, and they're designed to operate in that mode, and they're very hard to beat when they're like that. The flip side, though, I think to the over-under issue is the snap count problem, and something that we flagged a lot is the Ohio State-Notre Dame game. Notre Dame had 7 possessions in that game. Average is 12. And so this being a 30-point, 31-point each game may not necessarily reflect the fact that it thinks that this isn't going to be a shootout. It might actually reflect the fact that this game has the potential for ending really quickly. And I think there's one type of game that is really getting compressed, and that's games where the teams are getting a lot of first downs without huge explosive plays. If you have a high completion percentage and you have a lot of first downs, especially in first and second down, those games used to result in a lot of stoppages because you'd had a lot of first downs in the game. Now they're not. So the clock keeps running. If you go 3 and out over and over again, and I was kind of debating this with Brian Framu, he thought maybe that it was the 3 and out games that were getting affected. But I think at the 3 and out game, you at least have a stoppage every 3 plays. Where now I think what this is flagging, like that Ohio State Notre Dame game, when you have lots of long drives, it's just constant clock burn the entire drive. And one thing that Framu did show is, and he put up a graph, and then maybe we'll throw it up here, that he generated. And bcftoys.com, you can go through, and he has a whole bunch of stats on that. He's the author of FEI and F+, which is a combination of FEI and SP+. One of the original Football Outsiders guys. The 6 play per game drop is really kind of deceptive, and he charted something that we were suspicious of. The games that were really long have kind of disappeared, and the games that were shorter in the middle haven't changed very much at all. So 6 plays per game on average actually means in these kinds of matchups, we're actually seeing something like 10 to 15 plays less. And then a lot of other games you're only seeing 1 or 2. In fact, the majority of games are 1 or 2 plays shorter, and that's about it. But in games that would normally be high-scoring competitive affairs between 2 good teams, where there are more first downs, those first downs don't stop the clock. So a higher percentage of your plays are first downs And all those first downs are no longer stopping the clock, so it has a much bigger effect on those games. And they end up being 50, 60 play affairs where they were getting to the point where they were like 80 play affairs. And I think that the over-under in this game may actually really reflect that reality, where it's less about how much yards per play, how much scoring they have, and just the fact that this game may basically end a quarter earlier than it would have under last year's clock rules.
So what was interesting to me was, looking at the Notre Dame being favored, and I think there's maybe an angle here that Vegas is picking up on. Notre Dame's offense collapsed because it had to go entirely through Sam Hartman. And, Estime, who I'm really high on and has been great this year, he carried it 10 times, 2 yards an attempt. Overall, they ran for 1.6 yards per carry, which is abysmal. And Louisville's not a great run defense. They're a goodish run defense, probably slightly better than average when you're looking at versus expected. But
they are 56th in our relative performance metric.
So they're not great, but they're not terrible, right? USC is terrible. USC is objectively, in relative to performance, they're in like the 120s.
125. 125.
Yeah. So what they're picking up on, I think, is you talk about like break points and stall points and where offenses run into scaling issues. If you're good enough to make Notre Dame run for 1.6 yards per attempt and have the whole game go through Sam Hartman, then Notre Dame's offense is going to fall off a cliff. But they hit a point where they can hum pretty well if they're running the ball. And you can take some of that burden off of Hartman's shoulders, and maybe he doesn't throw 3 interceptions. I think that's something that Vegas is picking up on. But on the flip side of the ball, USC runs it well. Lincoln Riley's offenses are designed as run-first offenses. And, it's kind of shocking to me to see Notre Dame get run on by a fairly mediocre team, 185 yards rushing. Plummer got some sacks, so that took some of the totals away. But Jordan ran all over him, 143 yards, 6.8 yards per attempt. That's got to be a concern. Like, I see that Vegas says, okay, Notre Dame is going to run the ball. But you got to be a little concerned in that run defense not doing so great against Louisville.
Yeah, I think the realities for USC are a little scary for some of the smaller statistics coming out of that Arizona game, right? So they only had 365 yards. In regulation, they only scored 28 points. They were actually outgained by over 100 yards by Arizona in that game. And in general, they were outplayed and won anyway, which you got to give them credit for from a grit perspective. And this is one of those things where you have to separate wins and losses from predictive value, right? The fact that you're undefeated does not mean that you have shown quality such that I am going to pick you to win. Past results don't predict future outcomes. From a power rating perspective, that game was actually worse on paper than it was watching it live, or the result was, maybe on replay. And I'll fully confess I had to stop that game at halftime because it was midnight on the East Coast, and then catch up on it today because it went into triple overtime, as I did not know was going to happen. It is frustrating that you can't fully watch those games live that are occurring on the West Coast, but that's a whole other conversation. I do agree with you. I mean, the reality is that USC is built around the ground game. Lloyd had 5.7 yards per carry, which was very good. He was by far the most effective player, I thought, in USC from what I was able to tell. And I think the passing game has some really good players, but I don't know that there's really an Addison on that roster. Rice and Washington are good players. I mean, Mario Williams is a really good player, but it's not. It's a bunch of really good players, not a completely unstoppable one. And if you can stop the run game, I think it's possible to give USC fit. So, do you mind if I go ahead and transition into prediction here, Daniel? I feel like we're that time in the video.
Give me that pick.
Yeah, I am going with Notre Dame here. I'm going to say Notre Dame 37-34. So I guess that's slightly over in scoring. This feels like a game where people are low on Notre Dame and not necessarily picking up on the matchup issues. USC is a very disruptive front. I'm not sure that they're physical as much as they are fast, though. And Notre Dame is going to be able to play physical football with USC, and I think they're going to stop USC's rushing attack to an extent that no one was really able to this point. And I think USC is going to struggle with Notre Dame to stop them from the consistent play to an extent that Notre Dame's almost unaccustomed to. And I think both these teams are going to be really uncomfortable in this game. And I think it's going to be a tough game for both because they're both going to be uncomfortable. But I think this doesn't end up being such a high-scoring affair. I think they do have longer drives, and the game ends up a little shorter, and I think that actually plays into Notre Dame's hands. And I think we see a rebound from Hartman, who I said, I think he can play at a very high level. My criticism from him from the preseason, and it continues last week, I think kind of showed it. When he's not comfortable and on rhythm, he can play pretty poorly, or at least the outcome is pretty poor, even if he makes some good plays. And there were points where he was just missing throws flat out yesterday. I don't think that happens. I think Caleb Williams plays spectacularly, but it's a little too much him trying to be Superman. And against a Notre Dame defense that's really good, has some tremendous athletes, they're going to have a spy and a plan to control Caleb Williams. I just don't think he's going to be comfortable enough in that environment. And so I do think Notre Dame ends up pulling away with a win here.
I really struggle with this because I feel like all of the matchup things we've discussed really do favor Notre Dame in a lot of ways. But just at a high level, gut level kind of thing that's like, it doesn't make sense because it's not, it's not nerdy enough. But I just look at, you gave up 33 points to Louisville. You scored 20 points on Louisville. Louisville's not a great defense. They're better than USC, but they're not a great defense. And I think an offense as good as USC's puts pressure on your own offense to perform. And I think that at some point, USC is going to get in a rhythm that Notre Dame's not going to be able to. The last two games we've seen from Notre Dame were against Duke, who has, I think, an excellent defense, but not very talented, and Louisville, who's got a decent defense. The yards have just been so hard to come by. And scoring points has been just an exercise in just great struggle. And I think we're going to see them score easier this time, but give up points against a really hot offense. And they haven't seen a hot offense this year. We've talked about Ohio State having their troubles, and I think it's going to be a little bit shocking early, and they're going to have to dig themselves out of a hole, even though they're at home. I've got SC 31, Notre Dame 27. Josh, if this game, where does this game need to be for you to pick SC? Is it that 40-point threshold?
I don't know. I don't think there's a particular threshold. I think it's just going to come down to really... I would go so far as to say that once Hartman, if and when Hartman throws 2 interceptions, USC probably wins. They can't afford 2 turnovers in this game. And Grinch is a high-pressure defense. Statistically, it's why they're terrible. It's basically a defense that, in theory, is designed to get a few random stops because you think you're going to score more often than not. And so if you lean all in on generating negative plays on 1 out of every 3 drives, you'll win the game. That theory doesn't work in practice, I think we're saying. But, that's the theory. If he throws 2+ interceptions, I think they lose. That's the key to me. And the last thing I'll note, though, is the Louisville game isn't such a concern to me because I think Louisville maybe is a little bit underrated themselves. We have on collegefootballnerds.com, you can run the model for any 2 games you want, look at statistics, relative performance being, how good you are relative to everybody else that's played the teams on your schedule. So you run the ball 25% better than everyone else that's played that composite schedule. In the Nerd Performance Index for quarterbacks, Jack Plummer's actually 10th. Sam Hartman is 7th. I think there's a little bit of maybe an underestimation of that Louisville team, and that says a lot to me that maybe this wasn't so bad to give up 33 to Louisville, that maybe that's just an underrated school that had one kind of a clunker game against NC State.
All right, y'all, that's it for us on Notre Dame and Southern Cal. Let us know what you think the score is going to be in the comments, and we'll get down there and mix it up with y'all. Remember, like, subscribe, helps this channel out a ton, and check us out, collegefootballnerds.com. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.